To create the sewing patterns, I'm going to be working with the following measurements. I'm going to be measuring across my front chest. This is the part that is above my bust. I'm also going to go into measure around my bust line, which is the fullest part of my bust. And once I have that measurement written down, I'm going to go in to take my vertical measurement. So now I'm measuring from my bust line upwards how high I want my neckline to be. You can have yours lower or higher if you would like. I'm also measuring the vertical distance from my bust to my waist, as well as deciding on how long I want the entire corset to be. I kind of wanted it to sit around my waist, that part that is below my belly button. That's where I wanted it to be. Next up, I'm measuring around my waistline. This is the narrowest part of my body. It is slightly different for everyone, so I highly recommend you measure around your own waistline. Next up, I'm measuring around my belly area or the hemline, because that way I'm able to shape the corset to sit in a comfortable manner around my body. The next measurement I'm taking here is my nipple to nipple measurement. This would help me to plan my dart seams, which would cut through those very points on the corset. And then for the drapey piece itself, I'm measuring from my center front around my arm to my center back. Doing this measurement will just ensure that that piece is a comfortable fit around your arm. You don't want it too tight or too loose either. Now I'm going to take note of these measurements and to help me plan my patterns later on. But first, these are the materials I'm going to be using. My main fabric is this the red tie-dye satin I got from my trip to Lagos. And to line the corset itself, I'm going to be working with this lightweight neutral beige colored lining. This is a very lightweight anti-static lining. I ended up using only about half a meter. I also got myself some plastic boning. This is the type that is wrapped in fabric, so it doesn't feel like it's prickly on the skin. In addition to that, I'm going to be working with a pair of bust cups in my size. These ones are not too thick either. I also have here some bias binding. These are going to help me create the boning tunnels along the seams on the body of the corset. If you've watched up until this point and you haven't given this video a thumbs up and you haven't subscribed, this is your sign to do so. Starting with the front corset plan, I have a large sheet of paper here and I'm just drawing a short horizontal line on top. This is going to guide me to mark my other lines. From that line downward, I'm going to be marking 4.5 inches, which is the height of my neckline. And then from that point, I'm going to be marking the distance from my bust to my waist and my entire corset length as well. Once I have these vertical points marked, I'm going to go into square them across, which essentially means drawing a line that cuts through those points, and then along this line we would mark our half and quarter measurements, so that way we're able to ensure that everything is correct in the pattern before we cut onto fabric and stitch the garment all together. Once I have those lines drawn in place, I'm going to go across the first line on top and mark half of my across chest measurement. Once I mark that there, I'm going in to mark a quarter of my bust measurement along my bust line. And along my waistline, I'm marking a quarter of my waist measurement plus 1 inch for my waist dart. Now along the hemline, I'm marking a quarter of that around belly or around the hemline measurement. And once we have all those side dimensions marked in place, I'm just going in here to connect them together, drawing in that front arm curve, drawing in the side seam with the help of my pattern master and my marker pen. Now these are the main dimensions here before I go into mark half of my nipple to nipple measurement along my bust line. Now I'm going to draw a vertical line that cuts through that point, because along that vertical line I'm going to be marking away the 1 inch waist dart, and from marking that away I'm able to shape in the corset really nicely on the body. Now I'm just drawing in a dart that shapes in this direction towards the bust line, and then along the neckline I'm going to be marking 0.75 inch away on both sides. This would help the neckline to actually sit nice and flat on the body, and it just helps it sit and prevent any gaping that would happen. So that I'm going to draw back onto the bust line on the bust point like so, and then I'm going to go in to finish off the rest on the dart towards the hemline, pointing it in the direction where I don't lose any measurement along the hemline of the corset. To help me plan the sweetheart neckline, I am marking 1.75 inches above my bust line, and I'm going to shape that back into the horizontal straight neckline I drew earlier on. You can decide to have a square neckline, a sweetheart neckline, a V-shaped, whatever you like, but I'm going to be having a sweetheart neckline for my corset. Here I'm just going in to trace off my front patterns. I will need to trace off 2 panels for my front, one center front panel excluding that dart that we drew. Then I'm going to go in to add a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a 2 centimeter hem allowance before cutting out the patterns for my front corset. Once that is all done, this is what the first front corset pattern looks like. This one I'll need to cut on a fold, so I have one piece that sits right in the middle of the front of the corset. In addition to that, I also have the side piece which would be stitched onto that center front piece to help to create the front of the corset. Once that is all done, I'm going to set these patterns aside and focus on creating the back corset patterns. Now I'm going to be working from the front plan because the back is quite similar in terms of some of the lines. So I'm just going to fold over some pattern paper so I can clearly see the lines underneath. Once I have that in place, I'm going to add some tape and weights just to prevent anything from moving. And for the back, the hemline is the same, the side seam is the same, but the back arm curve is slightly shallower compared to the front. That's the first difference between the front and the back corset plan. The second main difference would be the neckline, which is a lot deeper. I would say it goes down to almost where the bust line is. I'll say it's about 1 inch above the bust line. And I think I should have just had the neckline go straight from the side seam edge to the center back rather than have that point where the arm curve is. But here I'm just going in to shape in the center back edge so I have a nice smooth curved fit on that side. Next up, I'm drawing in the darts here that just connect from the waist to the neckline, and then it connects down backwards to the hemline of the corset. Now that I have my back plan, I'm going to mark away any parts I don't want to trace off, and then like we did for the front, I'm going to trace off the center back edge, which has a seam allowance on the center back because I'm going to be adding a zip there. And then you have the side pattern, which would need to be stitched onto that center back or that middle pattern to create the entire piece for the back of the corset. So these are all of the patterns I ended up creating. I had 2 for the front and 2 for the back. For the drape piece itself, I plan to just cut that piece straight onto fabric because it's going to be like a long rectangular piece that would then be stitched onto the front neckline and then the center back edge. That's my plan for that drapey piece. For the back patterns, I should have just had the neckline go straight from the side all the way to that center back, but I would show you how I corrected this mistake as the tutorial progresses so you avoid making the same mistake like I did. If you're still watching at this point and you haven't given this video a thumbs up, make sure to do so now, and subscribe if you haven't joined the K Divas fam already so you'll be the first to know every single week when there are new tutorials on the channel. Now that we have all the patterns out of the way, I'm going to go ahead to cut out the main corset piece as well as the lining. I've pinned everything down in such a way that the pattern doesn't move around. I also added some weights because the fabric is ever so light and slippery. So I'm going to cut out my front and back pieces. I ended up cutting a pair for each pattern, and then for the center front edge I cut it on a fold, so I had one piece that just goes on that like middle center front edge. I also use the same patterns to cut my lining so that way I don't need to create different sets of patterns for my corset lining. I'm done cutting out all of the panels for the corset. I have my lining pieces over here, both for the front and the back, and then I have my front pieces which I've just marked with F with a tailor's chalk. I have my back, And then for the drapey shoulder detail, what I did was I cut a piece that is 15 inches tall because I want to sew this right side together and then bag it out and then attach it on the front and back necklines. And then it is 30 inches long, so this edge is on a fold, so if you open it out, it's 30 inches like total length and then 15 inches height. So I just ended up cutting two of these pieces here because I want one for the left and one for the right hand side. I think it's really cool how the wrong side of this fabric looks even interesting as well, even though the main side is this like orange and creamish type of tie-dye Adira effect. I'm just going to go ahead and stitch everything together and show you what it looks like when it's all done. The first thing I'm going to do is to join all of my corset panels together. I have pinned right sides together for the front and the back pieces, and I'm going to be sewing on a 1 centimeter seam allowance, joining all of those vertical seams. After stitching all of them in place, I went ahead to iron all the seams open and flat because it will make it easier for me to stitch on the bias binding to create the boning tunnels. Now, because I didn't have enough boning, I ended up actually just creating the boning tunnels on the dart seams, which is right in the middle of that back section and then across the nipple point. So I'm just going in here to pin the bias tape across the seam allowance like so, and repeat the same thing for all the seams I mentioned earlier on. So across this back seam on both sides and then across that middle point for the front. Now, once I had these bias binding taped in place, I'm going to go into sew along the sides of the bias binding, so I end up creating a tunnel between the bias binding and the seam allowance. Once I had done that for all of the tunnels or all of the seams where I had the bias tape pinned in place, I'm actually going to go in to add my boning. That way it helps the corset to actually stay up and stay firm. If you have more boning, you can go ahead to repeat this thing on all of your seams. It just would give you more hold and snatch along the waist. Now that I have that all done, I'm going to grab my boning and I'm going to be passing my boning through the tunnels. And I pass it in such a way that the boning stopped right at the edge, so I had enough seam allowance on the top and on the bottom, and that way I'm able to actually stitch on my lining later on as I finish up this corset. Now, once I'm done doing this for this particular tunnel, I'm going to repeat this for the front tunnels and the back tunnels, and as you can see, there's a little bit of gap at the bottom there as well as on the top, and it should just make stitching a whole lot easier. Now that I have all of these stitched in place, I'm going to set this aside and focus on working on the drapey piece because that will be the next thing that I need to fix. Now, this I have pinned right sides together and I'm going to be stitching up the open ends close. Once I sew that up on a 1 centimeter seam allowance, I'm going to go in and turn it inside out, give it a nice press, and repeat the same thing for the other drape piece for the other side of the corset. Once that is all done, I'm actually going to start off with one side and drape the piece along the front neckline and along the center back edge. Now, to do this, I'm going to start off with this side on the right side of the screen, and I will start off with putting the edge of the drape to that center front or right in the middle of that sweetheart neckline, and then I'm going to pin the other side just a few millimeters or like half an inch away from the neckline edge, and then I'm going to be pleating in 3 times, and each pleat is about 1.5 inch away from each other, so they are evenly spread across the neckline, and that way it just adds a little bit of drama and a little bit of volume. So I'm going to pleat in 1 time on this particular point like so on the front neckline. I'm going to pleat the second time just a little bit off from that or nipple point, and once I have that pleated in place, I'm going to turn to the back, and the back I'm going to start the first pleat roughly 1 to half an inch away from the center back, away from the back neckline, and then I'm going to just create 4 pleats along this edge like so. You can make smaller pleats if you want. I just found 4 to be the right amount, so the pleats are concentrated on the top half of the corset. I'll say each pleat was spaced from each other by about an inch. That's about how wide the pleats are away from each other, and it took a little bit of trial and error before they were evenly spaced. I forgot to actually mark this accurately, so you can do that if you just want to save yourself some stress and headache. Now, this was the point I realized I shouldn't have had the back neckline like this, but just have it as a straight neckline that goes from that arm curve on the side to the center back edge. So I'm just marking away the parts that I'm going to be shaving off. So if you're creating your pattern, you don't need to add this additional pointy edge that it has on the center back. Now, this is what the corset is looking like so far. I'm just checking that I'm happy with everything. If you have watched this far and you haven't given this video a like, please do so. It helps the tutorials to reach more people on YouTube, and don't forget to subscribe as well. Now, once I was happy with the pleats along the front and the back of my corset, I'm just going to cut away the excess parts on that center back edge I mentioned earlier on. This I had marked with a chalk. You can't really see it here because of the sheen that this fabric has, but I'm just cutting along that chalk line like so. This I repeated for both sides. After checking that all of the pleats are to my liking and it looks good, I'm going to set this aside and work on my lining. Now, the lining I have joined right sides together with just some pins for now, because I'm going to take this to my machine and sew up the lining in the same manner that I stitched up the main body of the corset. After stitching up the lining, I went ahead to give it a press and trim off the excess that center back neckline had. The same correction I made on the main body, I made on the lining as well. Now I'm just going in here to join the lining to the corset along the neckline. This I'm just doing with some pins for now. I'm also going to do this around the arm curve, down that back neckline, that center back edge, as well as along the hemline. This is what it looks like all pinned in place. I'm going to sew both layers together, ensuring I don't catch the drape piece, and leaving an opening like this to help me turn this thing inside out once I'm done stitching it in place. I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to be sewing on a 1 centimeter seam allowance around, and then a 2 centimeter hem allowance, because that's what we added in our sewing pattern. This I'm going to do from one end around the center back edge along the entire neckline, just double checking that I don't stitch any parts of the garment that is not meant to be joined together. And once I'm done sewing all of that in place, I made sure I left that opening on the hemline, because without that I would not be able to actually, turn this piece inside out. So after I was done sewing it all together, I went ahead to trim down the corners that it has on that back edge along the front arm curve, along the hemline, and then I'm going to go to the arm curve and just create tiny incisions. This is going to allow that particular part to just relax a lot more naturally when I turn this piece inside out. But before we turn the piece inside out, I'm going to be stitching down the bust cups. This I'm going to be stitching in this direction, so when it is flipped, it sits in the direction it's meant to go. I'm putting the pointy edges to the center or the middle of the center front, and then the curved edges to the side, and I'm just hand tacking the cups around the point where the bust line is, so that way the cup sits where my natural bust line or where my bust would be. This would actually ensure that when you have the corset on, you don't need to wear a bra. So after doing this for both cups, I'm just going to go in to turn the entire piece inside out, just to reveal the right side and to check that everything has been done correctly. Once it's been turned inside out, this is what the corset looks like. Everything is looking really good so far. I would say this neckline like so. I'm going to go into do like an edge stitch that would hold the seam allowance to the inner part of the lining. This is optional, but I just find that doing this helps that part of the neckline to just stay tucked inside. And here's a closer look at the neckline stitch that I did just to secure that part like so. I also went ahead to give the entire piece a nice press just to relax all of the stitching, and then I'm going to go into actually close off this bottom opening that we left to allow us turn the piece inside out. This I'm just stitching down with both sides folded together, doing like a very narrow edge stitch just to conceal that opening before trying it on. Now the last step to finish up this corset is to attach the zip. I'm going to be working with an open-ended zip in this like natural tan or creamish beige color. I tried to find an open-ended zip in orange. It was just impossible, like nobody had it, so this was the best thing I could find, and that's what I'm going to be working with. Now I'm going to go ahead to pin both sides of the zip tape to both sides of the open center back edge, and because we finished up the center back edge really nice and neatly like this with the lining, I essentially just need to stitch that back edge to the zip tape. I'm also going to cut off the excess on top of the zip and then fold it against itself, so that way I'm able to finish up the zip securely on that top edge. I'm going to go ahead to pin the other side of my back edge to my zip, and this is a part that I would say just take your time, because if this is done beautifully, it is so satisfying to watch. Like having those folds actually match, having the seam be as evenly spaced as possible. Just take your time stitching this in place because it will all be worth it. After stitching this side of the zip up in place, I'm going to this other side. I want to actually reach the point where the head is. I just lift up the footer and pull the head downwards, so it allows me to continue stitching up the rest of the zip. Okay, so this is what it looks like on. The fit on the body is divine. Like, look at that snatcheroo on the waist. I love the neckline as well. Everything is looking really good, but personal preference, I just think this drape detail is a little bit too long. If you don't mind it, you can leave yours that long. This is what it looks like, but you can either go in and so open this part up and tuck in the excess into this side. So you can either do that, or along this edge of the sleeve, this side, add an elastic that would absorb the excess along the shoulder here. So I think either of those two options should work.
The next day.
Good morning. The last time I saw you guys was yesterday, and initially I was going to create the gathered detail with an elastic band around the drape on the arm, but I woke up this morning with fresh energy and I'm going to unpick the neckline. I just love the center back. Center back is perfect. The gather, zip, everything is perfect there, so I don't want to touch that side. So I think I'm going to unpick the neckline, unpick that opening that I left. So it's going to be like a couple of hours to fix this, but that's what I'm going to do. I just wanted to catch up with you guys. So I'll unpick here, pull in the excess through the neckline, and I will show you what the final fit looks like. I would recommend that rather than add the extra 5" to the measurement when you cut out the piece, just work with your measurement, because I'm going to need to get rid of about 5 inches from the drape, which was the extra measurement I added. So when you measure from that center front to your center back around the arm, I say just work with that measurement. That kind of would do the trick, except if you want like to super drape and to fall really low, then you can add 1 or 2 inches, but yeah, 5 was definitely too much. So I'm going to fix that and then show you guys the final look. So this is the corset all done. I went ahead to make the changes as mentioned earlier on. I actually opened up the entire neckline, tucked away the excess measurement and trimmed it off, and then went ahead to stitch everything down, iron it, and tried it on. And I just find that I prefer the fit this way. You can decide to have your drape a lot more exaggerated and longer on the body, but I for one, I just prefer it like this. I guess it's a thing of like personal preference, but let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And if you'll be recreating this, don't forget to tag me on social media at Kim Dave Designs. This style is so trendy. I have seen it everywhere. People have so much fun with this neckline. People play around with the combination of fabrics, and I just think it's such a fabulous style to create. Even though it's a summer thing, I think even into the autumn it would be like a great project to try out. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please give it a thumbs up, leave your feedback and suggestions in the comment section down below, and until my next video, have a good morning, afternoon and evening wherever you are. Bye.